Have you ever spent your whole life grieving someone who was never actually gone? Brianna grew up believing her father had died. That pain became part of who she was. But after a terrible accident, a stranger walked into her hospital room and called her by a name only her father knew. In that single moment, everything she believed about her life began to fall apart. Because the biggest lie wasn't that her father was dead. It was who made her believe it. Brianna Cole was 22 years old and had been taking care of herself for longer than most people her age could imagine. She grew up in a small apartment in Louisville, Kentucky with her mother, Sandra, and the particular kind of quietness that fills a home when there are things nobody talks about. The walls were thin. The carpet was old. The kitchen always smelled like coffee and something Sandra was pretending not to feel. Brianna was the kind of girl who learned early that asking too many questions made her mother's eyes go somewhere far away and her voice go somewhere flat. So she stopped asking. She became fluent in the language of not pushing, of reading a room, of softening herself to fit whatever shape the moment needed. She had her mother's cheekbones and she was told her father's eyes. Dark and steady. The kind of eyes that saw things. Her father's name was Thomas Cole. He died in a car accident when Brianna was 2 years old, before she was old enough to form a real memory of him. That was what Sandra had told her. A car accident. A wet highway. A night in November. Gone before Brianna ever had a chance to know him. Brianna had a single photograph of him. A small, slightly blurry print that Sandra had given her when she was 8. After Brianna cried at a father-daughter dance she hadn't been allowed to attend. In the photo, Thomas was young, maybe 25, standing in front of a truck with his hands in his pockets, squinting into the sun. He was smiling. She kept the photo in a book on her nightstand and looked at it sometimes the way you look at something you love but cannot reach. She grew up visiting a grave she was told existed in a cemetery 2 towns over. She never actually went. Sandra always had a reason. It's too far, it's too cold, you don't need to put yourself through that. And Brianna, who had learned not to push, never pushed. She graduated high school with decent grades and a full-time job waiting. She took community college classes at night nursing because she liked the idea of being the person in the room who knew what to do when everything went wrong. She had a small apartment with 2 plants she was trying very hard not to kill, a best friend named Courtney, and a life she had built carefully and alone, the way people do when they've never had anyone to build it with them. She was 22 years old. She was doing okay. And then a Thursday afternoon in March changed everything. It happened on the intersection of 4th and Jefferson. Brianna had just finished a double shift and was driving home, still in her work clothes, windows down because the evening was unseasonably warm. She was tired in the heavy way that made everything feel slightly unreal, the kind of tired where you're running on habit rather than attention. She doesn't remember the impact. That's what she told people later. One moment she was at a red light, and then there was nothing, and then there were lights and voices and a pain in her side so sharp it erased everything else. The other car had run the light. The damage to her sedan was severe. She was conscious when the paramedics arrived but fading, and she spent the next several hours in surgery for a fractured rib that had kissed the edge of something it shouldn't have. She woke up in a hospital room at 2 in the morning with an 4 in her arm and Courtney asleep in the chair beside her. She was alive. Bruised and sutured and exhausted, but alive. Her mother arrived the next morning red-eyed, clutching Brianna's hand too tight and saying thank God too many times. Brianna let her. She was still floating in the gauzy aftermath of anesthesia, everything soft at the edges. She was moved to a recovery room that afternoon. And that was where it happened. The nurse who came in to check her charts was young, maybe a few years older than Brianna, with a kind face and the efficient movements of someone who had done this 1,000 times. Behind her in the hallway a man paused. He was tall, maybe early 50s. Gray at his temples and along his jaw. He was wearing a visitor's badge and holding a coffee cup, and he had clearly been walking somewhere else entirely, but he stopped. outside Brianna's open door. And he looked at her. She noticed him the way you notice someone staring, the particular weight of it. He took one step closer. His face had gone completely still, like a man who had just seen something he had spent years convincing himself he would never see. "Bree," he said. It wasn't loud. It was barely above a whisper, but it stopped every sound in the room. The nurse looked up. Brianna looked at the man, and something animal and wordless moved through her chest, some recognition she had no logical basis for, like a door in a house she'd never been in suddenly swinging open. "I'm sorry," the man said, blinking, taking a half step back. "I'm sorry, you look exactly like. I don't mean to intrude. I'm sorry." He started to leave. "What did you call me?" Brianna said. He stopped, turned back slowly. "Bree," he said again, like it cost him something. It's a nickname. For someone He stopped, pressed his lips together. "I'm sorry. I'm sure you're not. I'm sorry to have bothered you. What's your name?" she asked. The pause that followed was the longest of her life. "Thomas," he said. "Thomas Cole." The coffee cup in his hand shook slightly. Brianna felt the room tilt. She said very carefully, "Thomas Cole from Louisville?" His face broke open like something that had been held together for a very long time by something very thin. "Yes," he whispered. The nurse quietly left the room. Thomas Cole stood in the doorway of his daughter's hospital room. A daughter he had believed for 20 years did not want to know him. A daughter he had been told by the woman he once loved had been adopted by a new family. A daughter he had grieved the only way a parent can grieve a child who is still alive, silently, constantly, with no ceremony and no end. And Brianna looked at the man in the photograph on her nightstand. 20 years older. Grayer. Tired in the way that time and unanswered questions make people tired. But the same hands. The same jaw. The same eyes. Her eyes. They talked for 3 hours. He pulled the chair close to her bed and they talked the way people talk when they have 22 years and an ocean of silence to cross. Carefully at first. Then less carefully. Then not carefully at all. Thomas told her everything. He and Sandra had been young, 23 and 24, when Brianna was born. They were together but not stable, fighting more than not, and when Brianna was 2, Sandra ended it. He had tried to stay in Brianna's life, had called, had shown up, had gone to a lawyer about custody, and then Sandra told him she was moving, that she wanted a clean break. That she had met someone new and that Brianna would be better off with a proper family, a stable home, a father figure who was actually present. He had pushed back. She had threatened. The new man, she said, was going to adopt Brianna legally. Thomas would be erased from the paperwork. If he fought it, she would make sure the courts heard about his instability, his gaps between jobs, every imperfect thing. He was 25 years old. He didn't have money for a long legal fight. He was terrified of losing anyway. And Sandra had looked at him with those calm, certain eyes and said, "She'll never know you existed. It'll be like you were never there. She'll be better off." He had believed her. Or he had needed to believe her because the alternative, that he was simply being discarded, and so was she, was too painful to carry forward. He moved to Indianapolis. Rebuilt his life. Never stopped thinking about her. There was no new man. There was no adoption. Sandra had simply told Brianna her father was dead and moved to a different apartment across the city and raised her daughter on a lie so complete it had its own gravity. Brianna listened to all of it without speaking. When he finished, the room was very quiet. She thought about every Father's Day she had spent feeling a specific kind of loneliness. Every time she'd been asked about her family, and felt the absence like a missing tooth she kept touching. Every time she'd looked at that photograph and tried to construct a person from a single blurry image. She thought about her mother's careful deflections, the grave they never visited, the way Sandra would sometimes look at her, quickly, then away, with an expression Brianna had never been able to name. She could name it now. Guilt looks a lot like love when you don't know the difference. Sandra came back to the hospital that evening. She walked into the room with takeout bags and a forced lightness and stopped dead in the doorway. Thomas was still there. He stood when Sandra entered. Not aggressively. Just stood. The way a person stands when they want to be seen clearly. Sandra's face went through 5 different things in 4 seconds. "Brianna," she started. "Sit down, Mom," Brianna said. Her voice was quiet. It had that steadiness to it. The same steadiness she'd spent a lifetime developing in waiting rooms and difficult moments. The steadiness of someone who has decided they are done being managed. Sandra sat. "I want you to tell me the truth," Brianna said. "Not the version. The truth. All of it. Right now. While he's here." And something in Sandra, some wall she had maintained for 2 decades with enormous daily effort, finally came down. She cried. She explained. She said words like "I was afraid and I was angry and I thought it was better and I didn't know how to undo it." She said "I'm sorry" more times than the words could hold. Brianna let her talk. She didn't interrupt. She didn't comfort her. She sat with her broken rib and her 4-line, and she listened to her mother dismantle the story that had been the foundation of her entire life. When Sandra finished, Brianna looked at her for a long, careful moment. "You let me grieve someone who was alive," she said. "You let me grow up without a father because you were angry at him. And you never, not once, thought about what that did to me." Sandra wiped her eyes. "I know. I don't want an explanation right now," Brianna said. "I want you to go home. I need to think." Sandra looked at Thomas, then at her daughter. She opened her mouth and closed it. Then she picked up her things and left. Thomas stayed another hour. Before he left, he wrote his number on the back of a hospital napkin. "Old-fashioned," he said with a small, uncertain smile, but he wasn't sure what else to do. Brianna took it and held it in both hands. "I looked for you," he said at the door. "For a long time. I want you to know that." She nodded. She believed him. She didn't know yet what to do with that, but she believed him. After he left, she lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling for a very long time. The weeks that followed were not clean or simple. Healing rarely is. Brianna went home. She recovered. She returned to work and her plants and her routines. But everything had a different texture now, like the same city seen from a slightly different angle. She did not call her mother for 3 weeks. Not out of cruelty, but because she genuinely did not know what to say yet. She needed to process the lie not just as a single event but as a structure, something that had been built into every corner of her life, and now had to be carefully brick by brick examined. She called Thomas. They met for coffee first, then lunch, then a longer dinner where they talked about things that had nothing to do with the past, his work as an electrician, her nursing classes, a road trip he had taken once through Montana, a book she was reading. Small things. Human things. The things that make a person real rather than symbolic. It was awkward sometimes. Of course it was. You cannot replace 22 years with a series of lunches. But it was real. And realness, Brianna had learned, was rarer and more valuable than almost anything else. She met with her mother eventually. 6 weeks after the hospital. At a coffee shop, neutral ground, in the middle of the afternoon. Sandra looked smaller somehow. Like something she'd been inflating herself with for years had quietly deflated. Brianna arrived, sat down, ordered water, and looked at her mother across the table. "I'm not here to forgive you today," she said simply. "I'm here because I don't want to disappear from your life, the way you made him disappear from mine. But I need you to understand something." Sandra nodded. Her eyes were already wet. "What you did wasn't protecting me," Brianna said. "You know that, right? It was controlling me. You decided what my story was. You decided who got to be in it. And you took something from me that I can never get back. 22 years with my father. Sandra pressed her hands flat on the table. I know, she said. I've known for a long time. Then why didn't you fix it? The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Sandra looked at her hands. Because I didn't know how to admit that I'd been wrong for that long. The longer it went on, the bigger the lie got. And I was afraid of exactly this. She looked up. Of losing you. Brianna studied her mother's face. The face she had known her whole life. The face that had kissed her forehead and packed her lunches and sat with her through fevers and heartbreaks and every ordinary hard thing. A face capable of enormous love and enormous damage, often at the same time. You haven't lost me, Brianna said quietly. But things are different now. I have a father. He's going to be in my life. And if you can't make peace with that, then we're going to have a much harder road than we need to. Sandra wiped her eyes. I can make peace with it, she said. I want to. Brianna nodded once. Then we'll figure it out, she said. Slowly. She didn't rush anything after that. She wasn't the kind of person who rushed. She finished her nursing certification that spring. Thomas came to the small celebration dinner, sat at the same table as Sandra, both of them careful and polite in the way of people who have hurt each other and are choosing, for someone else's sake, to be decent. It wasn't perfect. It was never going to be perfect. But it was honest. And for Brianna, who had grown up in a house built on a lie, honest was everything. She still had the photograph on her nightstand. The blurry one of Thomas in front of the truck, squinting into the sun. But now she also had new ones. Taken on phones, in coffee shops and parking lots in a park in Indianapolis where they'd walked one Sunday afternoon and talked about nothing important for 2 hours. She was 22 years old. She had a father she was learning. A mother she was forgiving slowly and on her own terms. A life that was genuinely finally hers. And sometimes on quiet nights she thought about the version of herself who had carried that grief for so long, who had built an identity around an absence, and she felt something soft and sad for that girl. She had deserved the truth so much sooner. But she had it now. And she was never ever going to let anyone decide her story for her again.